Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on the 5 biggest surprises in writing the IT Manager's Guide to DevOps. I'm Christina Cardoza, news editor of SD Times. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. First, if at any time you have any questions about or during the presentation, you may submit them using the Control Panel's Questions tab. Secondly, this webinar will be recorded and available on demand through the sdtimes.com website in about 24 hours after the event. Here at SD Times, we know how important it can be to use DevOps to drive business value, but we also know that there can be many challenges along the way. The IT Manager's Guide to DevOps was written to provide insight into how to use DevOps and continuous delivery to successfully optimize software processes and drive business goals. Joining us today is Tim Buntel, and DevOps advocate of Zedia Labs, and TJ Randall, Vice President of Customer Success for Zedia Labs. Tim helps Zedia Labs enterprise customers maximize the impact of their DevOps and digital transformation initiatives, while TJ is the street smart DevOps technologist and business-minded VP behind the company's customer success team. Tim and TJ will discuss the most surprising things they heard while writing the guide, along with the challenges, victories, trends, and dead ends that are essential for you to know. Now that get things started, I'll turn it over to you, TJ and Tim.
Okay. Thanks, Christina. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. Really pleased that you're joining us today. I'm Tim Buntel. Christina gave us a great introduction there. I also happen to be, co-author of this book, so this is a particularly fun conversation for me. It feels like I'm doing one of the Meet the Author talks at the local bookstore. Albeit virtually. So imagine us in a nice, cozy local bookstore and go out and buy some books from indie publishers afterwards, as well as we'll tell you about how you'll be able to get a copy of this book. But before I do that, TJ, you want to say hello? Street Smart, that's a pretty good intro.
I know, that's pretty, I like that one. It always makes me smile because it's kind of like, wow, what's this guy doing out there with DevOps? So, yeah. In this nice cafe setting, we'll have some coffee and we'll talk about it.
Perfect, yeah. And I'm really thrilled to have TJ joining me today. Giggling about that description, but it really does capture TJ. He's one of the hardest working guys in the organization that's out there, spending incredible amounts of time with customers every day. Again, we're going to introduce you today to some of the things that we discovered while we were writing this update of this book. And of course, since we're talking about a book, the first thing I wanted to do was make it available to folks. We're going to have information at the end about how you can get an electronic version, but we do have 5 actual physical copies of the book that we're going to give away to attendees of the webinar today. The way you're going to do that is by asking us questions. So if you noticed before, there's that questions panel in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you use that while we're going through the presentation today, give us some questions. Make sure they're real questions. What's my favorite color, or my shoe size won't count. But give us some good, thoughtful questions based on your experience bringing DevOps to your enterprise, and we'll do a drawing from all of the folks who submit questions after the webinar. And within the next couple of days, we'll contact you by email and send you a copy of the physical book. So we look forward to that. And again, we'll give you some instructions at the end if you want to get a copy for yourself before then. So just kind of briefly about Zedia Labs, again, we want to keep this pretty general about DevOps and trends in the enterprise in general, but I think why we're uniquely capable of addressing this topic today is because this is all Zedia Labs does. So we're an enterprise DevOps company, been doing DevOps since before the term really existed, back in around 2008. And our focus is entirely on empowering enterprises specifically to build DevOps. So, we're out there every day working around the world with the very largest companies across all sorts of industries. We've been recognized by analysts and press throughout the world for our work there. And we really strive to help organizations that are going through these transformations. So we hear a lot as we're out there, and we encounter a lot of these problems, which allows us to really understand what's happening in the market, which is why we're excited to bring this book to you. Obviously, in addition to making software, ZBA Labs does other things for the community. So you might have seen this before, the periodic table of DevOps tools. This is something that we've been doing for a number of years now. It's available on our site. It's a great resource for exploring the kind of vast ecosystem of tools and technologies that are out there to help organizations implement DevOps. Obviously, as we get into some of the topics today, the proliferation of tools, I think, will come up as one of the challenges that we saw. But we'll also spend some time pointing to the non-technical or the non-product pieces of DevOps around organizational issues. So, what exactly is this book that I keep mentioning? Well, going way back in 2014, ZBA Labs put out this first book called the IT Manager's Guide to Continuous Delivery. Very, very well-received kind of practical guide to help introduce the concepts behind continuous delivery. Today, broadly DevOps, by the team at ZBA Labs and consultants from ZBA who were out in the early days having this experience in the kind of early 2010s. Had a great forward by Dave Farley. We distributed that throughout the world, tens of thousands of downloads, printed editions that we've given out at conferences and events around the world. But a lot has happened since 2014. We don't have to go very far to recall that the world looked pretty different in 2014. Obviously, I'm talking about in technology, right? But so earlier this year, we sat down and said, well, it's probably time to revisit this guide and think about how to update it and how to really create content that was relevant for today and the challenges that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. So in addition to all of the contacts that we tend to have with customers and non-customers alike, we conducted dozens of specific interviews just for putting this book together across, I counted 5 countries, but there's probably more. And we also, relied on our advisors. Gene Kim wrote a great new update to the introduction for us. And Dr. Nicole Forsgren, the amazing chief scientist at DORA, also provided lots of insight and guidance that we'll draw upon within the book and through the conversation today. So really spent a lot of time, actually started over a year ago on this. So fundamentally, this is more than just an update, which is why we have kind of come out with basically essentially a brand new book. So now we're calling it the IT Manager's Guide to DevOps. And we've added this subtitle that I think is pretty important for the challenges that we see there as well, which is really how to drive business value through software delivery. It's a pretty significant change over thinking about something like continuous delivery, which was the phrase we used in the first edition, because really we understand now that there is such a direct connection between business value, regardless of your organization, whether you're a company that sells something called software, or if you sell manufactured goods, or a services company, or in mining, or anything. There's business value to be captured in software, so that's all about the book here.
And so
yeah.
Tim, as you guys started in this endeavor, as you started out on this journey, did anything jump out at you in terms of, now you're talking to, like you said, you're talking to organizations in different countries. The DevOps space had matured. Did you notice that there was kind of some similarities that were growing out of, from the earlier edition?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing was that, we were, the amount of people who had already experienced, considerable experience within their organizations in some sort of DevOps journey was dramatically different from in the early days. The very first version of the book, we saw much more as a sort of guide that we could provide to help people who were just starting. Whereas in this case, it felt a lot more to me like learning from the best practices and the experiences that all of these organizations had gone through. So I think of it less as an introduction to the concepts, although that's certainly covered in the content, but more a way for us to share with everybody some of the experiences that others have gone through and that we've seen consistently out there, which I'm sure will probably be echoed by your experiences too, TJ. I will make I'll make a quick call out to my lead co-author, Rob Stroud. Sadly, Rob passed away earlier this year. We're all indebted to him and his great efforts. So there's a dedication in the book. We hope folks will take a moment to pause on that and thank, however you do that in your memory, the contribution that Rob made over the years to the DevOps community as well. So, TJ, carrying off, off of that point that you just brought up, there were a lot of things that we heard that were, basically what you would expect, right? The attributes of DevOps that make DevOps transformation successful that we tend to talk about in a lot of these webinars. But what I wanted to do today was really focus on some of the things that I consider a little bit more surprising, right? So these are things that we heard pretty consistently from lots of different folks that we were talking to, feedback from the field that were either surprising because we hadn't expected them, or surprising for how prevalent these issues were. So I think for the next few minutes we'll go through these, what I'm considering these sort of top 5 surprises. There's a couple more sprinkled in there, but hopefully by focusing on those, folks will get some idea of just how kind of quickly DevOps has come onto the scene and really transformed lots of businesses. Sound good?
Sounds like a plan.
Great. And TJ, obviously, I'll welcome you to interrupt as we go. Just hop in anytime, to sort of give your perspective from being out with customers who are implementing these projects at the same time. So yes, I kind of hinted to this one really early on. The reason I called out specifically the periodic table of DevOps is it, to me, is a great illustration of this discovery that we made in the book. We put the periodic table together originally as kind of a fun way to look at what tools were out there and categorize them by the different category, whether CI tools or databases or platforms. And over the years, we're now in version 3, I think, of it. It's gotten enormous, right? The periodic table of DevOps now eclipses the actual periodic table. So all of the building blocks of everything in the universe, takes up less space than the tools that we've highlighted in the periodic table. And that really reflects the excitement that's been in the industry over the last few years of DevOps. Lots of people are trying to build products that help with these transformations. But the flip side of that is it's led to a big challenge in organizations where suddenly they find themselves with, dozens of tools that may differ from department to department, which brings up a number of big challenges. A couple of them I called up here that we heard a lot. And I'll drill into them in a second, but TJ, flip it over to you. So have you seen this? Is this a trend that you've noticed in the last few years and a sort of a challenge for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're talking about large organizations, DevOps, right, one of the goals is to break down these silos, break down the barriers, get people working closer together, and, really putting together that full pipeline, that dev to prod pipeline. And what's kind of fascinating to see is developers will often solve their problems locally with the tools that they have and they like, the things that they like to turn to. So you'll have an organization in which it literally builds out, probably unintentionally, silos, simply because everyone's using different tool sets that aren't communicating. And then the operations folks are still kind of just as frustrated because they're like, how do I know who's delivering what? And we're not talking about the full pipeline, et cetera. So yeah, I can see why the DevOps, periodic table will continue to grow, for that reason.
Yeah, and I think what we often see is the cultural shift that has to accompany DevOps, sort of starting small and celebrating successes and being internal advocates for the change throughout the organization, encourages this kind of proliferation of tools, right? Because you're empowering teams to solve some of their problems autonomously. They tend to go out and adopt a tool that works for them, and it presents a big scaling problem when you try to take that to an enterprise, and suddenly you have organizations that are trying to standardize or understand how can we have visibility into what's going on when every team is relying on sort of different tools and different techniques for stringing them together. This will be the only kind of overt product pitch probably that I'll make here, but just the reason I point out ZBA Labs XL Release product is it came from this very problem, right? So as ZBA Labs was working initially on deployment automation and provisioning and some of the mechanical parts of it, we found this need to get tools to work together more harmoniously. And that was really the genesis of XL Release. So XL Release, just in short, I'm not going to make too much product pitch here, but basically gives you a single tool that allows you to orchestrate all of the different tasks that are happening within a release and pull them together. So no matter how many of those tools from the periodic table you're using, teams can have one view of that pipeline in XL Release that still allows all of those best-of-breed tools to perform their tasks, but gives the visibility, the control, the compliance, the management, and reporting of the overall process. No, I know, TJ, you've spent a lot of time implementing this, so.
Oh yeah, for sure. I actually was going to just chime in and just say we have a great question that's really appropriate for this topic. Is Elizabeth asked, who typically selects the tools in an organization? Do you find, and this for both of us, I think, the developers or the operations team? So do you want to go first in that in terms of like as you approach that? I'm sure that was something that was important in the book to call out.
Yeah, sure. Well, what I'll speak from the perspective of the book was we face this challenge with knowing who to talk to most, right? So, obviously DevOps is a portmanteau of development and operations. I would go further these days to say it's extended to include the business, it's extended to include security, it's extended to include lots of other stakeholders. So that's a big challenge, right? There's so many parties that are that have a stake in the successful delivery of value through software. It's hard to pinpoint exactly who. Now, my experience in the book was that we did try to spread that out. So we spoke to organizations that had particularly identified DevOps teams, right? So this was intentionally composed groups that had both development and operations and all of those other folks, or we went out to those individual organizations who might still be siloed within the organization, but that worked together to implement, DevOps and the DevOps platform. As for who drives the tool selection, TJ, what do you see out there?
I think you described it well. It's actually what I liked about the book is, well, it describes there's almost those kind of two models that happen within an organization. With large companies, often there's some sort of advisory board. I've actually seen a DevOps advisory board at one of our customers, and that's the place where if I'm a development team and I want to implement some new tools and technology, I would leverage them. The one thing that I'm seeing, which is for me encouraging, is it's more of a sounding board and a place where I can go and get consultation rather than the traditional advisory board that says yes or no. So I think as organizations, this DevOps thing really is about the people process, right, affecting that culture. That's actually a really good indicator you're doing it right, which is there's a new tool coming and that's okay, but how do I implement that in a way so that, as you call out, the business is involved with understanding how it affects them in all the different constituents. So that's that's the area I'm seeing the most.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, ideally, you empower folks to choose the tools that are most meaningful for them, but you implement just enough controls so that it's not utter chaos. It's kind of the way that I'd like to think about it. So that's a kind of a good segue into this next piece that I wanted to point out. One thing that I heard loud and clear was, as we invest more and more in some infrastructure that supports a DevOps initiative, so we're creating as many automated parts of the pipeline as we can from the time, an idea is created till the code is committed through CI, testing and delivery into the different environments all the way to production and beyond. A lot of folks think about the process, but in the past may have skimped on the infrastructure that supports that. But now we're tying all this business value to these systems that are going to deliver that value to our customers. Boy, it's really important to make sure that you're investing in that as well. Gone are the days where you should be cobbling together, Jenkins under somebody's desk, on a server that's not treated with the same care that you would treat to your production, delivery environment. So that was something I heard loud and clear. Have you noticed that as well, TJ?
For sure, and we've said this a lot in the last year, is that it's DevOps as a service, right? All of a sudden, these tools that developers need is being provided to them as a service offering. And what does that really mean? It has SLAs, right? As you talk about, it's not Jenkins running under someone's desk anymore. It's actually like, it has priorities, it has service levels, etc. Because we can't slow down, right? So your developers need to know that the tool chains that they're using has to be up and running at all times. So that's where, in my mind, DevOps has matured too, is that now these organizations are providing it as a service to their teams.
And I'll say more and more organizations that I talk to today, I would probably say the majority of who I would consider, high-performing DevOps teams have actually made that a metric that gets reported all the way up to the CIO or the CTO's office, is the availability of the CD pipeline tools. So this has really become something that these teams are measured on, they're goaled on, and the very highest levels of the company understand are critical as any other business system.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of reporting and metrics, this is one of our favorite topics, one of my favorite topics. I've spoken about and written about this many times. We did a really great webinar. I mentioned Nicole briefly earlier. She's joined me on a couple of occasions to talk about this topic. But, as more and more organizations have gotten on board with DevOps and embraced the ability of DevOps to transform the way they do their business, as you get more and more critical recognition of this, just like I said with reporting up to the CIO, demonstrating that ROI becomes really important. You're going into an organization and asking them to make investments in infrastructure. You're requesting investments in processes. You might be doing organizational realignments and reorgs. And with all of that, it becomes very important to help the organization understand the value that that's actually delivering. I say here, what I heard time and time again was a lot of organizations start small. There's maybe one little pocket of a team somewhere that starts practicing some of these DevOps approaches, but then really scaling it becomes very difficult. And the best way to do that is to continually tell the story about the impact that it's having so you can prove it to the organization. And this last bullet emphasizes the fact that visibility and ROI isn't necessarily only for reporting up. It's also about improving quality within the team. So the better you can demonstrate to your developers, for example, how they are getting changes into production or getting the ideas of the business in the hands of the customer, the more accountability they feel for it, right? So this is where things like dashboards are so important. Almost every organization that I talk to has some sort of dashboard in a highly visible place, and people feel ownership for it, and it ends up improving the quality of the software.
I think one other aspect too that becomes important to measure and showcase that is in large organizations, often there's more than one DevOps initiative taking place, right? There's different teams in different locations, working on different technology, etc. And they basically have built out a practice that works for their particular area of the company. Of course, then you have to go out and you got to convince your peers. Like I think, once you've made that investment in that smaller, more focused team, you need a way to sell it. And having metrics, ROI metrics, it's an important aspect to say, hey, there's 15 ways to do this. This is why we feel this is important. And of course, metrics speak volumes in terms of like what you've been able to accomplish. So I encourage the teams that I work with, this is probably the most important feature of any project that we work on is, before you get started, what are the types of things you want to measure? How would you, promote this initiative to your peers when you're successful? And, sometimes that's a new concept for people like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way, but it's so critical for success.
Right. Right. And, everyone who talks about DevOps always says that the people come at the center of it, and successful organizations share those successes and celebrate them, and some of the challenges. And we're going to come back to a people challenge in a minute. But the next one I wanted to point out is around containers. So, I think you too, TJ, I do this almost every year. I get called upon to prognosticate, what's coming up in the next year. What are going to be the big trends in DevOps? I often do that. And I think every year for the past 3 years at least, I've said, this is it. This is the year that containers are really going to get broad adoption. And I went out fully expecting to hear that the amount of folks that are, embracing containers and orchestration platforms for containers was going up. This survey is probably already too far behind. This was about a year ago, the 67% that was using or evaluating containers of these larger corporations. I personally, anecdotally, from research for this book and my other work in DevOps, I think that number is probably higher. But so that's not the surprise. I think that's a relief. So I could stop including it on my what's coming next year list. I think the thing that's surprising is that many organizations are already starting to think what's beyond containers, right? So potentially leapfrogging containers. And I'll point to two Amazon technologies to sort of back that up. So Fargate is one that we've been doing some great work with the AWS team and some of our customers. Fargate is sort of a deployment approach for containers that further abstracts away the orchestration layer, right? So Kubernetes, for example, or the Amazon Container Service gets abstracted away, and the container itself is really the only object that you have to worry about, and you can kind of spin those up on demand. So further abstracting containers into the self-contained unit in the cloud. And then even one step past that, you further abstract the actual container as a self-contained runtime away with Lambda, right, where you have function as a service. And I'm starting to see more and more companies that are saying, we're not just going to build microservices architectures around containers and orchestration platforms, but we're going to smartly deploy function as a service with its really incredible elasticity with some workloads that might be containerized, or maybe you have traditional monolithic architectures where you're just breaking pieces off and delivering them as functions as a service. So I think we're definitely beyond that point of container hype and actually already casting our glance off into the future. TJ, is that ringing true with where you've been recently?
Yes, for sure. And I think the reality is this technology, it doesn't seem like kind of pie in the sky, right? To your point, like containers, everyone understands this. These are real initiatives inside of large organizations, and they know in order to compete and grow, they have to move in this direction. So we really are past that point. And I think now what our customers are looking to us for is they need help, transforming those applications onto these stacks. So they have really, smart people that understand the target technologies and what they want to accomplish. And it's really the transformation that a lot of my conversations revolve around. It's like, how exactly are we going to peel off these microservices and manage the dependencies, et cetera? But that's good conversation. Maybe that's what makes me street smart, right? It's, the actual how-to. So the technology is phenomenal that's there, and customers are really hungry to take advantage of it.
And we spoke to everything from relatively small startups that were 100% cloud native, born in the cloud, all the way up to what you would consider fairly traditional legacy enterprises. And one of the indicators for me, time and time again, of the highest performing organizations was this openness to experiment, find the right technology, mix and match these technologies, and find the ones that work. So definitely encourage folks to be thoughtful about always looking out to what's coming up next, because there might be a good chance that it's going to suit your needs in your company. Security, probably after metrics. This one is the topic that gets me most excited. We started with this notion of DevOps as being about the workflow and eliminating friction between development and operations, right? Building value in software and running it. But we've expanded that understanding of DevOps to include a lot of different pieces. And the one that I think I see most organizations still struggling with is around security. And it's not surprising, right? So security has always been something that has been a challenge for companies. It's a relatively specialized skill that not a lot of developers have, a lot of organizations don't get. And it was bad enough when we shipped software 2, 3, 4 times a year. But if you look at the statistics coming from our friends at DORA, high-performing DevOps organizations are shipping 46 times more frequently than non-DevOps organizations. So imagine those challenges of getting proper security insight and security coverage just gets amplified that much more when you're shipping that much more software. So more software means more risk and more potential for flaws. Then that gets compounded by the fact that a lot of organizations don't have any security expertise out of IT. Maybe they have somebody who looks after firewall or antivirus, but thinking about how do you architect your applications securely, there's very few organizations that have that. And then even in the companies that do have security expertise that's trying to drive security around software and applications, in those organizations, the security pros are vastly outnumbered by the developers. So, a couple of organizations that I talked to were 70 to 1, 100 to 1. One was basically one person for the entire organization who was in charge of this. So it really means that if you are expecting to have something called the security team secure your software, when you're embracing DevOps and all of the increased velocity that comes with it, you are going to be in for a bad surprise sooner or later. So this is really something that's critical for folks to embrace. And I have to say, of all of the things that we looked at in the book, this was the one piece where I think we saw the least consistent solutions, right? There was really, this is something that I think a lot of organizations are frankly still struggling with. TJ, does that ring true with your experience too?
Absolutely, and I'm thinking of one particular customer. One of the ways that they're trying to deal with, to your point, the rate of change is growing exponentially, and they're trying to make sure that the developers aren't, hindered by the deployment process, right? Moving their changes from development through the pipeline towards prod, but at the same time, embedding security as just part of the overall process. And one facet of that is we have a customer. They've introduced a center of excellence, which it was like a reintroduction, like they kind of had one 10 years ago and it went away. But this center of excellence is not a security team as in they're going to come in and check all your code. They're the ones that are actually providing the templates and the best practice. So again, it gets back to that consultative nature of DevOps. Now the developers who have these mandates and they don't know where to start, they can actually turn to this team and say, hey, okay, this is the type of application we're building. Here's our technology stack. And they have somebody with the organization to deal with those, the troublesome ratios. And it's actually, I think that's kind of exciting, right? It's a great way to be able to share knowledge in a way that lets developers keep working.
Yep, I agree. And in many ways, it follows a parallel that we saw with quality years ago, right? So, back when I was starting, it was the usual practice was you had this QA team that sat somewhere else and developers finished their software and handed it off and they didn't think about quality. It was somebody else's responsibility. you'd be chased out of the company if you proposed that model today. And so the way that we built responsibility for quality and for performance and availability into software throughout, everybody owns that now, right? Everybody's concerned with quality. That's exactly the model that we can look to with security. So still a big challenge, but definitely something that that organizations have to figure out. The more value we put into software, if we say we're all software companies, we better well make sure that it's secure. Okay, so I did mention this people thing. We talk about that in every conversation we have. But one of the surprises that came up again and again was, understanding that you're not always going to get agreement to this, right? There's a lot of pushback and resistance that gets brought up. Obviously, organizationally, anytime change is involved, that happens. At the last year, Gene Kim hosts a sort of enterprise summit for DevOps that we participated in last year, and produced this nice study called Individual Contributors to address this kind of notion of holdouts. We actually did a webinar that you can see the recording of on our website, but it took a stab at going into what are the types of holdouts that you might find in the company, and it ranges from folks who who try to kind of command the entire experience, folks who are reluctant to change altogether, folks who kind of want to be the ones that direct everything, and ultimately understanding why people might resist the changes that come with DevOps is as important to its success as empowering the folks who want to make that happen. TJ, I know you were kind of giggling a little. I'm guessing you see some familiarity in some of these personas here.
Yeah, one or two. I think that what forces this the most gets back to that concept of DevOps as a service. So if you're providing a service out to your organization, all of a sudden playing one of these roles actually it's not an option anymore, right? Like your developers will never know who the folks are that are actually providing that service. So what we try to do, like one of the things we try to do is try to help people understand, like you can still be, the hero, right? You can still be the folks with the great ideas. The fact of the matter is you need to think across the organization. That's where your true value is as a contributor. And so, the title says it all. It really is a people thing, and helping people understand, like, you don't have to be the hero to be the smartest guy in the room type of thing. It's more of like, take your skills and your expertise and help these other teams actually across your organization. So,
yep.
It's what do we always say? It's people, process, tools, and the 2/3 of it, that's the hardest part. So.
Right. And there's going to be plenty of folks who say it's a terrible idea, even if it's a great idea. Just know how to deal with them. But then I'll give a flip side of it. We tend to get bogged down in this kind of wonkish kind of talking about DevOps as improving velocity, and it's all very kind of abstract. But one thing that I heard many times is that this is something that makes teams happier, right? So this is straight out of this year's DORA State of DevOps report. The high-performing DevOps teams spend less time on manual work because they're able to automate a lot of that stuff, which means they get to spend more time on new work, right? So building features, being creative. And we heard time and time again from development teams that by removing a lot of this drudgery and a lot of those roadblocks and a lot of the waiting that happens when you're delivering value through software, these kind of boring periods where your momentum gets interrupted by the processes. By doing that, you end up, suddenly having more time to devote to the stuff that you really want to do. And fundamentally, I think that people who are in software are creative, and they enjoy creating value that way. We also see it reflected in job satisfaction. So companies that have embraced DevOps find it easier to hire and retain great talent, right? Who wants to work for a company where you still have these really, arcane processes for getting software into production, and it takes months and months before your work can impact customers. So I'm sure you see that too, TJ, that you know, this really, once it clicks, boy, it excites folks, I think, in companies.
Yeah, exactly. And I think right at the end of the day, developers want their code changes, enhancements, and features, right? These creative things that they build running in production. So the goal is, right, how do I get it there as safely and securely as possible? We actually have one customer where they have basically 5 blueprints. So the developer doesn't even really need to know what goes on inside of those blueprints. They call it 5 ice cream flavors. And you're like, okay, Mr. Developer, which flavor would you like to deliver your code to production? And I've talked with those developers during actual release events, and you're exactly right. Their satisfaction is just through the roof because they're like, I don't know, I commit my code, I do the testing, and it's off, and then it's running. And being able to provide that makes happy developers for sure, and it makes everyone else happy because you're getting more consistent code with higher quality, etc.
Yeah. So definitely, you know, as we talk about these kind of nerdy side parts of it, don't forget that at the end of the day, this is people. Again, it's a people thing. These are people who are working day and night to deliver value to customers. So emphasizing some of these kind of other attributes is quite important. So with that, why don't we flip over to some questions? I'm hoping that folks have been asking some questions, hoping to get a copy of the book. We'll spend a few minutes on that, and I'll leave this up while we're doing that. In addition to us drawing the name of some folks who will get a hard copy of the book, if you're interested in a digital copy, you can go to zblabs.com. In the resources section, there's a form that you can fill out to download an ebook version of it. So do check that out, even if you don't get a physical copy. So I think we've got time for a couple of questions here. So let's jump right in.
So first one, I've been saving a couple of these. There's some really good questions, so be prepared, Tim. All right, the first one, Lee asks, DevOps is such a large change in journey. Tools, infrastructure, organization, security, agile. As you continue to look deeper globally, where would you recommend starting?
Yeah, we get this question a lot. You know, what's the first step that you can take? And often, so I'll give 2 parts of it. One piece of guidance that I always give is wherever you start small. So find a small pilot where you can experiment with some of these concepts and these ideas before building on that success to expand globally, especially if, as you suggested, you're in a much more complex organization. So that's one part. That's kind of a tactical, that's kind of a strategic approach. Start in small, environment where you can spread. The tactical advice that I tend to give is we do talk a little bit in the book about a technique called value stream analysis that we see a lot of successful organizations employ that looks at all of the individual steps that go into delivering software. And you analyze, what's the time that's spent on that? What are the gaps in between those steps? What are impediments or inputs that are required? And it helps give you a good picture of where some of the low-hanging fruit might be in your process. If you find that there's a manual process, for example, getting an approval to move from one environment to another environment, something like this. If you find these roadblocks, those give you a good idea of something that you might target with automation, for example. Right. So by understanding what the process looks like today before you start DevOps, it can give you this, this kind of suggested roadmap for the pieces that you can start to eliminate. You don't have to go from 0 to full DevOps expert overnight. Incremental improvements are a great way to do it.
Excellent. And so I'm going to plug this is my Street Smart plug for the day, by the way, to summarize what you said. Whenever we get asked that question, whether it's a brand new customer, whether it's a new team, we always say, take 1 to 3 of your applications, but do the work that you want to do from development through production. And the reason we say that is it's easy to automate in dev, right? It's easy down there. It's like production is really where you're going to push those organizational boundaries. So echoing your start small, we always say 1 to 3 apps. And that might be different across organizations, right? It might be an actual application. It might be the whole thing, right? The infrastructure plus the application. But yep, so I would second your suggestion. Okay, George, great book with tons of excellent info. What are your thoughts on how customers are applying software engineering principles to DevOps? For example, defining patterns and templates for pipelines to help with scaling out DevOps to the enterprise.
Yeah, I think this is a great point. You know, a lot of the things that we see tool-wise in DevOps came from engineers, right? So these are things that people built in-house to do it. For me, probably the most impactful is the way to handle code-centric approaches to doing a lot of the DevOps pieces, right? So, you know, if you're defining your release pipeline as a code artifact, well, so that gives you a few things, right? That gives you the ability to capture and view that and make it repeatable, but it also allows you to apply many of the same engineering best practices that you do for your code to your process and to your kind of DevOps approach. So that could mean, you know, putting it under source control, doing peer code review, you know, having a change control process for that. So some of those kinds of things, I like to think, to encourage teams to do that, to say, think of the way you build software as a product in itself and think of ways to improve it and apply the same engineering practices.
And just one thing to add to that, I would say is I love the idea of organizations having an area where those teams can go internally to talk about these things and to learn about that. We have many organizations where, for example, they'll have their own internal DevOps days events where, you know, the developers, the QA people, the engineers, the project managers, they all get together and actually focus on these topics. And I think that's just, you know, imagine being a developer on a team that wants to modernize and really your resources are all from external sources. It's much nicer to have something internal to say, okay, who's been successful doing this here and how do we do it ourselves?
Yeah, and a quick plug for, you know, I mentioned the dealing with holdouts, that we had done a webinar on that. We also did a webinar on the opposite, which was how do you amplify the successes, right? So how do you create these internal DevOps days, or how do you create a culture of sharing success, and how do you create a culture of learning within an organization? There's some incredible examples in that webinar, and IT Revolution also produced a you know, a kind of pamphlet, a short guide on that as well. So if you're interested in that topic, some of those are technical, but some of them are also, as you suggested, TJ, organizational. Definitely check out the webinar and that IT Revolution book.
That's excellent, excellent. All right, I think we have time for one more question. So we have Eileen asked, so what is the answer? Oh, we should have asked this earlier in the slide. Sorry about that, Eileen. So this says, so what is the answer for security, capacity, capability to support DevOps teams? So as we were talking about security, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So, you know, I think there's a lot of interesting things happening there. Again, in some ways it's a combination of tools, but also of people and processes. So the first thing that we see, that I heard from organizations who are doing that, is first and foremost the awareness of security, right? So recognizing that security is an attribute of quality. And just like you wouldn't wait till the last minute to think about quality, you can't think of wait till the last minute to think about security. So that's the step one, right, is to get organizations to recognize that. So your once a year pen test is not going to cut it, right? You need to think about integrating security. And then there's a combination of tools and practices that we heard time and time again that were pretty good. Integrating security testing earlier in the process. There's a number of good technologies out there for automated security testing, static analysis of code. Some new companies are coming on the market all the time with products that can basically help build security into the DevOps pipeline. So we talk about that a little bit in the book. The other one is applying some of the engineering best practices for software development to secure software development. So for example, in the same way that agile teams will write use cases or user stories, companies can write abuse cases or abuser stories, right? Where you're thinking about what are some of the attack surfaces, or what are some of the valuable assets that you have in your application, and how might people try to abuse them. And so building that into the problem-solving phase of the software process, just like you would for user functionality, has had some success. So there's a few things, a few ideas in the book, but those are a few that come to mind. TJ, anything to add that you've been excited by?
The one thing that I see often is, security is like one of those words like communication. Like people say it, like, oh, we should communicate better. And what's kind of funny about it is we're all communicating, right? It's what does better look like? And I think a challenge that a lot of organizations have is everyone understands they have to build security into this. But a lot of times I see it as the organization just looks to the developer and says, okay, just make it happen. Like it's like easy schmeezy, just take care of it. And so I think it's important for an organization to understand there's a lot of different levels to the complexity as well. The example that I'm thinking of is we were at a customer last week where they were basically trying to build their security scanning in their release process in such a way that the developers could move from dev to QA, right, the next environment, with a scanning score of around 65%. So they said, we'll keep the functionality of the applications moving forward so that they can start their formal business testing. But at the same time, the developers knew that it wasn't finished. And I think that's an interesting way to describe the problem, because you're not going to leave the QA phase of a deployment, right, go towards prod at 65%, but you don't want to lose 2 weeks in your process because they're fixing other particular, areas. And I think that's why release orchestration is such an important topic around security, simply because you have to find ways to, speed the process up while still meeting the requirements.
Exactly. And that goes to this notion of risk, right? I mean, there's risk always involved, and understanding, what are acceptable level of risk can sometimes be liberating, especially when in DevOps, it gives us a good ability to recover from problems very quickly, right? So by having a great deployment automation solution that makes rolling back or changing production code a non-event, if you get into trouble, it's very easy to get that high mean time to repair, right? To roll back very quickly. So there's a lot of this balance that you have to strike between what's acceptable level of risk and know that sometimes you need to unleash that creativity because you have confidence that if things go wrong, which they will, you can recover from it very, very quickly.
Excellent. All right, so looking at the clock, we have time for one more question. I think this one sums up a couple of the different questions. As you're writing the book, it's kind of a two-part question. Did you just consider large enterprises, or did you look at smaller companies? And really, the second half of the question is, how does company size impact success with DevOps?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So we did our best to try to talk to lots of different organizations. When you get to the very, very small companies, your startup with a single engineering team, a lot of these issues, don't come up, right? Because you're building a process, you're sitting next to the person. So we really see the need for DevOps become more critical as the organization grows. That said, even the smallest companies need to think about, what's the most efficient process for delivering value to your customer, right? And that could be from the guy sitting on your left with the idea to the woman coding to the operations person sitting on your right, right? But the challenges definitely change as you go up to larger enterprises. So I would say for this book, a lot of the content here is focused at helping folks in larger organizations understand the challenges that they might face, understanding the technologies that are out there and how to apply them to their situation. But again, they're generalizable across lots of companies. And when you come to those big companies, they're all of the kinds of challenges that we've been talking about, right? Teams operating in silos, geographic distribution of teams, combination of new software and legacy systems, combinations of environments. You've got public cloud, you've got bare metal on-prem, you've got mainframes, So all of these kinds of issues tend to be the ones that we see plaguing the big companies. So same principles, same techniques apply, but you're solving the problems at a different pace and on a different scale as you grow into larger and larger enterprises. TJ, I know this is one that you deal with all the time, right? Because you're out there with many of the largest enterprises in the world trying to solve these problems.
That's correct. And the thing that I will always say, sometimes one of the most interesting features of that is even in the largest organizations out there, they sometimes behave and act just like your smaller companies that are struggling with the same problem, right? So it just basically means that some of the areas that need to be addressed as part of the transformation, that to me highlights that you may have people or process things that you have to take a look at, right? It's not the size of the organization per se, it's actually the teams having the ability to move and communicate and implement change.
So I encourage everyone, come and grab download an ebook copy of this and put it on your manager's desk, put it on your CTO's desk. The guide was written for that purpose, to help you be an advocate for change within your company, leveraging DevOps to get value to your customers. So whether you're looking to do this yourself or whether you're looking for a handy guide for the manager in your life, whoever that may be, we hope you find the book helpful. And thank you so much for taking your time today to learn about it. TJ, thanks so much for joining me. Any last words?
No, it's just to let folks know that we're sorry we ran out of time, but some excellent questions, by the way, came through there. So always great to see that people are listening, participating. So just know that we encourage you to please reach out via our website and social channels. Let's continue the conversation there. And we'll be drawing at random for who receives the book. So we'll reach out in the next couple of days for that. So Tim, thank you very much to you and your team as well. This is an excellent addition. We're really excited.
Terrific. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.
Great. Thanks, Tim and TJ. Thanks for the excellent presentation. Again, that was Tim Buntel, DevOps Advocate for ZBA Labs, and TJ Randall, Vice President of Customer Success for ZBA Labs. I would also like to thank ZBA Labs for sponsoring today's event, as well as attendees for joining us today. Until next time, I'm Christina Cardoza with SD Times.